Slow it down, Stace. In through your nose. Hold it. Now let it go.
I am, Dad. It just feels...
Stay with my voice. You're okay. You've done this 1,000 times.
Okay.
That's my girl. Hands where I can see them. Step away from the girl.
On a humid Saturday morning in Oakwood Park, Elijah Freeman, a 50-year-old senior medic with the FBI's evidence response team, a decorated former Army combat medic, and a man who had kept soldiers alive in conditions most people couldn't imagine, was kneeling in the grass holding his daughter's hand when a rookie police officer with 8 months on the job and 20 years of unchecked bias decided, without a single word of introduction, that what he was looking at was a kidnapping. He saw a middle-aged black man crouched over a light-skinned child who was struggling to breathe, and he didn't ask a question, didn't assess the situation, and didn't call for EMS. He reached for his handcuffs. What Officer Lucas William didn't know, what he was seconds away from learning in the most catastrophic way possible, in front of multiple recording phones, a viral bystander video, and eventually a federal courtroom, was that the man he was about to slam against his patrol car was a trained tactical medic who knew constitutional law well enough to strip him of qualified immunity before the cuffs finished clicking shut. That the child he left gasping on the grass while he made his arrest would require a life-saving needle decompression procedure performed by her own father the moment those cuffs came off. And that his decision that morning would cost him his badge, cost his chief her job, and cost the city of Charlotte $14 million. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we go further, drop your city in the comments. We want to know where you're watching from. And if you believe a black father should be able to save his daughter's life without being treated like a criminal, hit like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Oakwood Park on an early Saturday morning has a rhythm to it that belongs to no particular season, but feels most like itself in late spring. The humidity arrives before the sun does. The trees hold the night air a little longer than everything else. Joggers pass in intervals, nodding at each other the way strangers do when they share a ritual. Children's laughter drifts from the direction of the playground, carried by a breeze thick with cut grass and pollen. Too much pollen, what as it would turn out, for one little girl's lungs to handle. Near the East Bench Trail, a father and daughter were finishing the last few minutes of their Saturday routine. Elijah Freeman was 50 years old, built lean and deliberate, with the kind of stillness that comes not from comfort, but from years of learning to perform under pressure. He had spent a decade as a U.S. Army combat medic before transitioning to the FBI's evidence response team, where he now served as a senior medic, the person you called when the situation was already bad and getting worse. He was trained in mass casualty triage, field surgery, and tactical emergency care. He had kept people alive in war zones, in active crime scenes, and in the back of moving vehicles under gunfire. He was also, on this particular Saturday at 8:09 a.m., just a dad. Stacy Freeman was 11 years old, with her mother's light complexion and golden brown hair, and the kind of quiet determination that made every person who knew her story feel something close to reverence. She had been born premature, critically so, and the first weeks of her life had been a negotiation between her tiny body and the machinery keeping it going. She had survived, but her lungs had never fully forgiven the world for the terms of her arrival. Severe chronic asthma had been her companion since infancy. She carried a rescue inhaler everywhere, the same way other kids carried phones. It wasn't a precaution, it was a necessity. Their Saturday routine was simple: a light jog followed by controlled breathing exercises that Elijah had adapted from pulmonary therapy protocols. It was the kind of ritual that looked ordinary from the outside, but carried the full weight of everything they had almost lost. At 8:11 a.m., the pollen count spiked. At 8:14 a.m., the inhaler failed. The status asthmaticus, a severe asthma attack that does not respond to initial bronchodilator treatment, does not announce itself slowly. Stacy's breathing shifted from labored to desperate within 90 seconds. The muscles between her ribs pulled inward with every breath, her lips beginning to shade toward blue. The wet rattle that replaced her exhale was not a sound a parent forgets. Elijah dropped to his knees instantly, His hands moving through an airway assessment the same way a pianist moves through a piece they've played 10,000 times, without thought, without hesitation, with complete and total precision. He checked her airway, tracked her breathing rate, reached for his phone. He never got to dial. A shadow crossed over them, and a voice came down hard from above. "Hands where I can see them. Step away from the girl." Officer Lucas William was 42 years old and had been on the force for 8 months. And before that, he had spent 2 decades in private security, a career that had given him confidence in his own authority without ever requiring him to operate within the constitutional limits that govern police conduct. He had joined the department the previous year, and in the short time since, he had already accumulated what his supervisors had quietly noted as an aggressive interaction pattern, though no formal action had followed. That morning, while William had received a dispatch call at 8:09 a.m., the description was almost insultingly vague. A suspicious male near the park trail, possibly loitering around a child. No behavior described, no crime reported, no physical description beyond race and approximate age. William drove over without asking for clarification. He entered the park, scanned the trail, and passed over the white jogger stretching near the entrance, the older couple walking their dog, the woman pushing a stroller. But his eyes settled on Elijah Freeman, a black man crouched over a light-skinned girl who was clearly in distress, and in the space of a single glance, with no questions asked and no facts gathered, he reached a conclusion. He was already reaching for his belt as he walked over. "Hands where I can see them. Step away from the girl." Elijah looked up. His daughter was turning blue, his phone was in his hand, and the officer's hand was not on his radio. The metal was cold. Elijah registered that detail the way medics register everything, clinically, without reaction, as Officer William pressed him chest first against the patrol car and clicked the cuffs shut behind his back. 11 feet away, Stacy was on the grass, her small body working harder than it should have to do the one thing it was supposed to do automatically. William stepped back and crossed his arms. "Scene's not secure. Nobody moves until I say so." This is where most people would have panicked. Elijah Freeman was not most people. He understood something that took most civil rights attorneys years to explain to a jury. An officer's verbal commands do not override their legal obligations. Scene control is a legitimate tactical concept, but it does not, under any department SOP in the country, permit an officer to ignore a visible, life-threatening medical emergency unfolding in front of them. The moment William chose his handcuffs over his radio, he stopped managing a scene. But he started building a case against himself. Elijah kept his voice even. "Officer William, I am formally notifying you. This is a medical emergency. Your department's standard operating procedure mandates that you call for EMS immediately upon identifying a person in medical distress. You have not done that. By choosing restraint over response, you are establishing what courts recognize as deliberate indifference, a legal standard under the 14th Amendment that removes qualified immunity when an officer consciously disregards a known risk to life." William told him to be quiet. Elijah kept talking, not out of defiance but out of strategy, because 30 feet behind them, a woman named Sarah Jenkins had already hit record. Sarah was a 33-year-old middle school teacher who had been stretching near the water fountain when the confrontation started. She didn't hesitate. Her phone came up, and she began narrating with the calm precision of someone who understood exactly what she was documenting. "This is Oakwood Park. The time is 8:17 a.m. Officer badge number 4172 has a man in handcuffs. There's a child on the ground who is not breathing normally. The officer has not called for an ambulance." 2 other bystanders pulled out their phones and began filming from different angles, creating what would later be described in court as a triangulated visual record, multiple perspectives that made any dispute about the sequence of events essentially impossible. This is called tactical witnessing, and it is one of the most powerful accountability tools available to a bystander. Badge number, time, specific officer actions, or specific officer inactions, narrated aloud, on camera, in real time. Sarah Jenkins didn't just film a video that day, she built a legal exhibit. William, growing visibly agitated, pointed at the gathering crowd. "Back up, all of you." Then, turning back to Elijah, I got a call about a male matching your description acting suspicious near a minor. Elijah tilted his head slightly. What behavior did I exhibit that was suspicious? Silence. What specific, articulable behavior, not appearance, and not a vague call, but behavior, formed the basis of your reasonable suspicion under Terry versus Ohio? William had no answer, and that absence of an answer was not a minor gap in his justification. It was the entire foundation of the legal case against him. Terry versus Ohio established in 1968 that a lawful investigative stop requires an officer to point to specific and articulable facts suggesting criminal activity. Skin tone is not a behavior. A vague dispatch call is not evidence. And proximity to a child of a different complexion is not probable cause. Without articulable behavior, there was no legal stop, which meant the handcuffs were an unlawful arrest from the moment they closed. On the grass, Stacy's body was losing the fight. The intercostal muscles that had been pulling sharply with each breath were beginning to go slack, a sign that exhaustion was setting in, which in status asthmaticus means the body is approaching respiratory failure. Her gasps were becoming shorter, shallower. A bystander took 2 steps toward her. William moved to block them. Then, a second patrol car came in hard from the north entrance. Captain David Miller was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. He had been rerouted from a nearby call when dispatch flagged an escalating situation at the park. He was also, as fate and justice sometimes arrange, someone who had sat across a conference table from Elijah Freeman during a joint FBI-CPD task force training session the previous month. He took one look at the scene and his voice came out like a thunderclap. "William, what the hell are you doing?" "Captain, I have a suspect in custody for—" "That is Elijah Freeman. He is FBI. Get those cuffs off him right now." William's hands didn't move immediately. That hesitation, that 3-second pause while a child lay dying on the grass, would later be replayed for a jury 17 times. Then the cuffs opened. Elijah didn't look at William. He didn't say a word. He was already moving, 10 feet, 5 feet, dropping to his knees beside Stacy, with his hands reading her the way only a decade of trauma medicine teaches you to read a body. Airway partially obstructed. Breath sounds absent on the left side. Attention, pneumothorax. The lung had begun to collapse under the pressure of trapped air, a known catastrophic complication of severe asthma exacerbation. He looked up at Miller. "I need a 14-gauge needle. Anybody? Medical kit? Now?" Someone ran to a car. The kit came back in 40 seconds. What Elijah performed next, a needle thoracostomy, inserting a decompression needle into the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line to release the trapped air and allow the lung to re-expand, is a procedure that most paramedics are trained to perform and most civilians will never witness. The crowd went completely silent. Sarah Jenkins kept filming, her hand steady. The only sounds were Elijah's quiet count and then, after a moment that felt like much longer than it was, the soft, unmistakable sound of Stacy drawing a full breath. The ambulance arrived 4 minutes later. By the time the paramedics reached her, Elijah had stabilized her oxygen saturation, cleared her airway, and was holding her hand. He stood slowly when they took over, and for the first time since the cuffs had closed, he turned and looked directly at Officer Lucas William. "You didn't see a father," he said. "You saw a suspect." William's face, which had held its defensive set through the entire encounter, did something it hadn't done once in the previous 9 minutes. It shifted. Not into remorse, not yet, but into the particular expression of a man who has just understood for the first time exactly how wrong he was. Behind him, Sarah Jenkins slowly lowered her phone. The recording was still running. The ICU at Mercy General was quiet in the way that only hospitals are quiet, not peaceful, but suspended, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Stacy Freeman lay in the bed with a pulse oximeter clipped to her finger and an oxygen mask fogging softly with each breath. The attending physician told Elijah what he had already known from the moment he heard her lung give way on that grass. Another 4 minutes without intervention, and they would not be having this conversation. Elijah sat in the chair beside her bed for a long time without moving. And the clinical calm that had carried him through the park, through the handcuffs, through the needle and the crowd and the ambulance ride, All of it had done its job, and now it was gone, and what was left underneath was just a father in a hospital chair, watching his daughter breathe. He let himself feel it. Then he picked up his phone. By the time Elijah made his first call, Sarah Jenkins had already posted hers. The video went up at 11:42 a.m. and crossed 1 million views before sundown. By the following morning, it had been picked up by every major national outlet. The headlines wrote themselves, "FBI medic handcuffed while daughter dies. Officer stood by and watched. Father saves daughter's life seconds after cuffs come off." The framing was impossible to argue with because the footage was unambiguous. Badge number visible, timeline clear, Stacy's condition visible to anyone with eyes. The FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility notified the department formally within 36 hours. Internal Affairs opened its investigation the same afternoon. What they found when they pulled Officer Lucas Williams' personnel file did not surprise anyone who had been paying attention, though it should have alarmed everyone who hadn't. 3 prior complaints from civilians, all alleging that William had stopped them without cause and treated them as suspects based on appearance alone. 3 investigations, 3 dismissals, no retraining ordered, no formal reprimand issued. The pattern was documented, filed, and then deliberately left unaddressed. And that last part, as the investigation would reveal, had not happened by accident. This is a concept worth understanding: deliberate indifference at the institutional level. Courts have long recognized that a city or department can be held liable under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, the federal civil rights statute, not just for what an individual officer does, but for what a department fails to do when it has clear notice that an officer poses a risk. 3 complaints create notice. Dismissing all 3 without action is a policy choice, and policy choices have consequences in federal court. The civil rights attorney retained by the Freeman family, a constitutional litigator named Patricia Owens, filed 4 distinct claims within the week: unlawful arrest under the 4th Amendment, civil rights violation under Section 1983, reckless endangerment, and failure of the duty to care. On the question of qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that shields officers from personal liability unless they violated a clearly established right, Owens argued the defense was simply unavailable here. Elijah had cited Terry v. Ohio by name while in handcuffs. He had named the SOP violation aloud on camera, back in real time. He had handed the officer every legal signpost a court requires an officer to have seen before immunity can be stripped. You cannot claim you didn't know the law when the man you were arresting recited it to you. Captain Miller's cooperation proved essential. In his formal statement, he confirmed what the dispatch logs already showed. The original call had contained no description of specific criminal behavior, no verified identity, and no corroborating observation. It was, for in the precise language of Terry, nothing more than a hunch laundered through a phone call. It had never met the legal threshold for a stop, let alone an arrest. The public reaction moved in 2 directions simultaneously. Online, the debate centered on something that rarely gets named directly: the particular suspicion that law enforcement and civilians alike sometimes project onto biracial families, where a difference in skin tone between a parent and child becomes, in the minds of those operating on bias, evidence of a crime. Advocacy groups began compiling documented cases. Parents of biracial children shared their own encounters. At City Hall, protesters gathered for 3 consecutive evenings, their signs carrying Stacy's name. Then, on the 6th day, a memo leaked. It had been sent 14 months earlier from Williams' direct supervisor to the chief of police, recommending mandatory bias retraining and a formal performance review following the 2nd civilian complaint. The chief's response, documented in writing, was a single instruction: close the file. The story that had begun as the misconduct of one officer had just become something larger, more systemic, and far more difficult for the city to contain. Individual officers make decisions, chiefs make policies, and policies, when they fail, have a way of eventually making the news. The federal courtroom had none of the drama that television assigns to these moments. No gasps from the gallery, no theatrical objections. Just the quiet, methodical work of accountability. Documents handed to clerks, exhibits marked and entered, a jury of 12 people doing their best to absorb the weight of what they were being shown. They heard the 911 audio first. Not Elijah's call, he never got to make one, but the original dispatch recording, the vague, behavior-free report that had sent Officer William into the park with a conclusion already formed. The jury heard what it was. Nothing. A description with no behavior attached, no crime alleged, no specific observation of anything except the presence of two people who made someone uncomfortable. Then they watched Sarah Jenkins's video, all 9 minutes and 43 seconds of it. Attorney Patricia Owens asked the judge to pause the footage 3 times, once when William's hand went to his holster before he said a single word, once when Stacy's lips were visibly blue while William stood with his arms crossed, and once when a bystander stepped toward the child and William physically blocked them. The jury watched each freeze frame in silence. The expert witnesses built the case in layers. The pulmonologist was first. She explained status asthmaticus in terms the jury could hold on to. Not a severe asthma attack in the common sense, but a physiological emergency in which the bronchial passages lock into a state of sustained constriction that a standard rescue inhaler cannot reverse. Without escalating intervention, she testified, the condition progresses to respiratory failure. She then stated, plainly and without qualification, that the documented delay between Stacy's collapse and the arrival of EMS had increased her mortality risk by a measurable and significant margin. The 4 minutes that William spent establishing scene control were not a procedural inconvenience. They were 4 minutes inside a window that closes and does not reopen. The police policy expert addressed the SOP question directly. Every major department in the country maintains a duty to care provision requiring officers to summon emergency medical services upon observing a person in obvious medical distress. It is not discretionary. It does not pause for an arrest. The policy exists precisely because officers regularly encounter medical emergencies in the field, and the law has long recognized that a badge does not permit someone to watch a person die while they complete paperwork. William had not just failed to follow the policy. He had been told out loud in real time by the person in handcuffs exactly what the policy required. That detail mattered. The constitutional scholar closed the expert testimony by walking the jury through Terry versus Ohio with the patience of someone who understood that the case had been decided in 1968, but was still being relitigated in parks and diners and traffic stops across the country every single day. Reasonable suspicion requires specific, articulable facts pointing to criminal activity. Not a feeling. Not a demographic, not a mismatch in skin tone between a father and his daughter. Facts, behavior. And William had neither, and the dispatch log proved it. Elijah took the stand and did what he had done in the park. He was precise, composed, and devastating. He described the color of Stacy's lips. He described the sound of her breathing. He explained without bitterness that the legal language he had used while handcuffed was not a performance. It was strategy. But he had understood in that moment that the outcome of the encounter depended on whether there was an unambiguous record of what was happening, and so he had created one. He had named the precedents, named the policies, named the violations, not to educate Officer William, but to ensure that no court could later pretend the law had been unclear. William testified that he had feared a kidnapping. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brief and surgical. What behavior had suggested kidnapping? None cited. What verbal exchange had raised concern? None identified. What had actually driven his decision? The answer, excavated through 7 questions with no viable responses, was the one thing the law explicitly forbids as a basis for suspicion: the way 2 people looked standing next to each other. The judge denied qualified immunity before the case reached the jury, ruling that Elijah had clearly cited established constitutional law during the encounter, making any claim of ambiguity impossible to sustain. Settlement negotiations began within a week. The city agreed to $14 million. William was terminated and faced criminal charges for official misconduct and child endangerment. The city council held an emergency vote and removed the chief of police, citing her documented decision to suppress the earlier complaint recommendations. An institutional failure the council determined could no longer be characterized as an oversight. At the press conference that followed, reporters expected relief, maybe even satisfaction. Elijah stood at the microphone in a quiet, dark suit and looked directly into the cameras. "This was never about money," he said. "It was about the 4 minutes my daughter spent on the grass while someone with a badge decided what she was worth." He didn't say anything else. Stacy came home from the hospital on a Tuesday. She walked through the front door under her own power, her inhaler clipped to her waistband, and went straight to her room without saying much. Elijah led her. He understood, better than most, that the body and the mind do not recover on the same schedule. The lung heals faster than the memory of what collapsed it. In the weeks that followed, the fear announced itself in small ways. Stacy would go quiet when a police cruiser passed on the street. She stopped wanting to visit the park. She began sleeping with the lights on, which she hadn't done since she was 7. A child psychologist who worked with trauma survivors explained it in terms that Elijah recognized from his years treating combat veterans. Her nervous system had been rewired by the event, trained to read safety cues differently. The park, the open air, the sound of gravel under approaching footsteps, all of it now carried a secondary signal her body refused to ignore. Healing, the psychologist told him, was not the absence of fear. It was the slow, deliberate work of teaching the body that it was allowed to feel safe again. Elijah understood that work. He had spent his career doing it for other people. Now he was doing it at home, at the dinner table, in the small daily negotiations between a father and a daughter, trying to find their footing after the ground had shifted beneath them. While Stacy healed, the legislation moved. State legislators introduced what the bill's sponsors named without fanfare or consultation with the Freemans. They simply felt it was right. Stacy's Law. The bill did 3 things that existing policy had only suggested and courts had only partially enforced. It mandated 40 hours of emergency medical training for all active duty officers, covering triage assessment, emergency recognition, and EMS coordination, not as an elective, but as a condition of continued certification. It explicitly codified the duty to care, establishing that an officer's obligation to summon medical assistance for a person in visible distress cannot be suspended by an ongoing investigation, an arrest in progress, or a claim of scene control. And it banned, in statutory language, the use of racial or familial appearance mismatch as the sole basis for reasonable suspicion, the first law in the state to name that specific pattern of bias directly and attach legal consequence to it. The 40-hour training requirement drew the most debate. Critics argued it was impractical. Supporters pointed out that officers were already required to complete regular firearms recertification, defensive tactics training, and legal updates. The idea that medical emergency response didn't belong on that list was, advocates argued, itself a policy statement about whose emergencies were considered worth preparing for. Elijah didn't testify at the legislative hearings. He submitted a written statement instead, 3 paragraphs, clinical and precise. He had said what needed to be said at the press conference. He was already building something else. He left field operations that fall. The FBI's training division had approached him months earlier, and he accepted a position designing and teaching a course in constitutional policing for federal recruits, a curriculum that used real encounters, real footage, and real legal outcomes to show new officers not just what the law required, but what happened, specifically and documentably, when those requirements were ignored. The body camera footage from Oakwood Park became one of his primary teaching materials. He would pause it at the moment William's hand went to his holster, before a single word was exchanged, and he would ask the room a question that had no comfortable answer. What information did he have at that point? And what decision had he already made? The discussion that question opened, about assumption, about bias, about the distance between what an officer sees and what is actually there, was the one Elijah believed the profession had been avoiding for too long. He intended to make it unavoidable, one training cohort at a time. Months later, on a Saturday morning in early autumn, Elijah was sitting on a bench at the east trail of Oakwood Park when Stacy came jogging around the bend. Her stride was light, deliberate, still slightly careful, the way it always was now, the body negotiating with its own history. Her inhaler was clipped at her waist. She was breathing on her own. She slowed when she reached him, hands on her knees, catching her breath. "Dad? Yeah? You still counting my breaths?" Elijah looked at her for a moment, at the morning light catching her hair, at the color in her face, at the simple and extraordinary fact of her standing there. The every single one. She rolled her eyes the way 11-year-olds do when their fathers are being exactly who they are, and kept running. Some battles are fought in courtrooms, others are fought in the space between one breath and the next. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. Genuinely, that means something. Here's the lesson I want you to carry with you. A badge does not suspend the law. It obligates you to it. Elijah Freeman survived that morning not just because he was trained, but because he knew his rights well enough to speak them out loud, under pressure, in handcuffs, while his daughter was dying. That kind of knowledge isn't just for FBI medics. It's for all of us. If this story moved you, educated you, or made you think, share it. Send it to a parent. Send it to a teacher. Send it to someone who needs to know that the law can be a shield if you know how to hold it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every share, every subscriber, every recommendation to a friend keeps these stories reaching the people who need them most. I'll be back tomorrow with another story just as powerful as this one. And while you're here, the previous video is on your screen right now. Go watch it. You won't regret it. Stay informed. Stay protected. See you tomorrow.